Thank you all for coming. My name is Nancy Scola. I'm a senior technology reporter at Politico. Our session today is on online free speech and internet access, which is always a fascinating topic, and we have a great slate of panelists to talk it over with us. To my left is Mark Nelson. Mark is the senior director at the Center for International Media Assistance at the National Endowment for Democracy. To Mark's left is Angela Greiling Keane, the deputy technology editor, also at Politico. And to Angela's left is Maiko Nakagaki. She's the program officer here at the Center for International Private Enterprise. So I'm gonna ask a few questions of our panelists. We're gonna have some open discussion. And then I wanna save a good amount of time for questions and back and forth with the audience. So if you can be thinking through as we're talking what it is you might wanna talk over with our panelists, that would be terrific. So we're gonna get started. Maiko, I have a question for you to start. We talked a little bit about the fact that in Cameroon last month there was a 3-month internet shutdown in the English-speaking part of the country, part of the country that was, had a bit of tension with the French-speaking government. It lasted 93 days until it was finally sort of reinstated last month. I had not heard of that before you brought it up.
Oh, okay.
And that's something as I care about the internet, I care about West Africa. What is happening that that governments around the world can do those sorts of things, get away with it for 3 months, and not have that resonate in other places around the world?
Sure. I first wanted to refer to statistics. Brookings came up with a great report last year that in 2015, the global internet shutdown costed over $2.4 billion. And I think economically it's a big issue, but no one has been calculating the number figures of what global internet shutdowns equate to. Like you mentioned, the Cameroon case was very widely known among the digital activist community and people who are very concerned about, say, West Africa, but maybe not so much globally. And there are great organizations like Access Now who try to highlight issues of internet shutdowns. But whatever, for political reasons, regionally or globally, they often do not get the message or the alerts globally, I believe. When we do hear about global shutdowns, it's during election times. So for instance, Uganda had their presidential elections in February 2016, and the Electoral Commission shut down social media on election day, and that was widely reported around the world. But I believe continuous shutdowns for countries that are not geopolitically significant are not highlighted.
Okay. And are these happening more frequently than they've happened in the past, less frequently?
From my experience, I do believe more internet shutdowns are happening, and I also think that's because people are using VPNs to report the shutdowns as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's the best response to sort of address one of these shutdowns? Does it have to happen on the government level? Is there a civil society response? What's sort of effective?
Sure. I think it goes both ways. There should be international pressure from organizations like Access Now or the peers that we work with. But also what's really important is the grassroots level of civil society, business community, talking about why internet shutdowns is harmful for individuals rather than not being able to take out money from an ATM or communicate with their families through WhatsApp and so forth.
Okay. So you mentioned WhatsApp. Mark, you've talked a little bit about social media shutdowns in particular. Can you talk about the current state of how that's happening around the world?
Well, I think one of the reasons that we're seeing this is that we've had an incredible growth of connectivity in the world that has just been really one of the great and remarkable stories of our time. There are now more people connected to the internet than ever before, and it's growing at an exponential rate every year. There are more mobile subscriptions in the world than there are people. So this access that is really becoming globalized has made governments really nervous because people are able to communicate to each other. They're able to evaluate the performance of governments and to organize to resist unperforming governments. So governments get really nervous about this, and the growth of social media has been one of the tools that has connected people in a way that's really relevant to their lives. I mean, we're now seeing in countries in Africa where Facebook is by far the #1 method by which people get access to news. So the growth of these social platforms has been so important that it has made many governments really reluctant to give up the old power that they had of being able to interfere in the news cycle or to get their own messages out without being challenged. And I think that's the reason we're seeing this kind of change at the global level.
Is it better to be a civil society group now, having access to those tools, but knowing that they can be shut down, or was it better in the past when things might have been a little bit more grassroots and ground-based?
It's much better to be civil society now because these, access to your to like-minded groups in other countries and knowing what to do and how to communicate when something goes wrong. I remember back in the days when I used to work at the World Bank on anti-corruption, the ability of civil society to organize when somebody was imprisoned or when a journalist was jailed or when some action was taken by a government. It took days. It took, and you had to use radio and television, and you couldn't usually get access to that, so you had to write letters to the editor. So it took a lot more time and a lot more organization. Today, when someone is jailed or when a government takes like the action in Cameroon, it very quickly moves out to those people, the activists, both in the country as well as outside the country. And those, as Maiko said, both kinds of activism are really necessary most of the time to get something to change.
Okay. You mentioned Facebook and the dominance Facebook has as a news distribution mechanism in a lot of parts of the world. Do companies like that have a responsibility to be at the forefront of some of these conversations about shutdowns?
Absolutely. I mean, I think they play a really important role, both in maintaining if they're playing the role of a platform, that's almost like a public utility in a certain sense. They're providing an infrastructure for these conversations to take place. So they have a role to play both in ensuring that this continues to take place, that those transactions and interactions and communications are done in a way that are serving the interests of their customers and of society at large. And I do think they have a role to play in many aspects of the problems that we are experiencing right now.
Maiko, in the countries that you work in, can you talk a little bit about the countries, just list some of the countries where you've worked, and
Sure.
this view of things like Facebook as a public utility? Does that resonate on the ground there?
Sure. I can speak broadly about where CIPE works. So, for instance, Myanmar or Burma is a great example. In the short amount of time, the cost of SIM card has gone to $2,000 to almost $2 in over time of like 2 years. And given Facebook's initiative for, I forget what they're actually called now, but free internet, where they've worked with mobile companies to bring Facebook for free for many of people. It's used as utility, I believe. There are some arguments that it's not positive to have these type of platforms for free because of advertisers and so forth. But on the other hand, I think it's a great tool for civil society and for citizens to express their opinions and mobilize and so forth, which they were not able to do even a few years back just because of the cost and the restrictions they faced.
Okay, excellent. So Angela, we've talked a little bit about the use of some of these social media platforms as means by which we talked about in Cameroon, people resisting the government using some of these internet tools. In the US, we've seen that in the recent months in the sort of opening phase of the Trump administration. There was did people follow this debate about the alt or rogue accounts? There were some people who were claiming to be federal agencies or groups of federal workers using Twitter to sort of push back against the Trump administration. In recent weeks, the Center for Border Protection filed a subpoena, I believe, to get the identity behind one of these rogue accounts. Twitter pushed back. There was a back and forth. The government dropped it. Are we seeing the relationship between, you've been covering this stuff for a long time, the relationship between the U.S. government and the people that might be providing resistance to the government, how has that changed in the U.S. with the use of social media tools? Is that different than it was a bunch of years ago?
I think it is. We've seen some pretty marked changes just since the new administration came in. Nancy just highlighted the kind of the prototypical example. After the election and after the inauguration specifically, we saw a lot of these either rogue accounts from federal agencies purporting probably actually being run by employees of these agencies who felt a bit muzzled in what they could say officially, so they were creating alternate Twitter accounts, mostly Twitter. But we also saw one in, I think it was January, it was the Badlands account, some of you may remember this. It was the official Badlands National Park account, and what it turns out happened was an employee who had worked there and didn't work there anymore, but still had the password to the account, took over the account and was tweeting facts. It wasn't, a bunch of wild things. It was purely facts about climate change, but it stood out in stark contrast and really got an increasing amount of attention as the day went on, and people tuned into the fact that this account was tweeting, again, facts about climate change. The White House didn't like it, and they clearly haven't liked these rogue accounts that keep on going. The Badlands account was turned back to its rightful owners and tweets about come visit Badlands National Park or whatever now. But these other accounts, the rogue fill-in-your-blank agency, a lot of those are still going. And the one that Nancy referred to was, let me make sure I got it right, the Customs and Immigration Service. So it's part of the Department of Homeland Security. And the White House, for some reason, or the administration, picked that account to go after. Maybe it tweeted some things that were especially inflammatory. I haven't done an analysis to compare that one to other rogue accounts. But the administration tried to force Twitter to reveal the owners of the account. So the lawsuit was filed. Twitter filed a lawsuit against DHS one day. 2 days later, it was dropped because the simple act of Twitter filing the lawsuit and all the attention that lawsuit brought sunlight can do a lot of good, and it certainly did in that case. The administration quickly backed down, and as far as we know, hasn't filed more suits of that sort. However, the main reason that suit came to light was because Twitter went public about it and talked about it, and then all of us wrote about it. So there certainly could be more percolating that we don't know about yet. Some of it's a matter of whether a company like Twitter is willing to speak up and talk about how things are changing and insert themselves into that debate.
Do you think that you've covered the White House for a long time? Are administration officials more willing to push back against this sort of free flow of information than they have in the past, or administrations for generations have not liked people speaking freely?
Of course. I mean, there's a natural tension, certainly, between the press, even a free press like we have in the U.S., and the government. And that's the way it should be and the way it has been for a long time. And we certainly see that now. And in the U.S., we're fortunate to have a lot of these freedoms enshrined in the Constitution. Not all the countries that we're talking about here have those things. But there's a much more public degree of back and forth, to put it nicely, hostility, to put it more extreme, than we've seen in recent administrations. Obviously, there's a lot of public debate. Watch any White House press briefing, watch the Saturday Night Live recap of it, take your pick. But you will see that tension and back and forth that's at a very different level than we've seen in recent administrations. To be sure, the Obama administration pushed back plenty, and the Obama administration had the unenviable distinction of having prosecuted the most leakers of, well, not just the most of any administration, but the Obama administration alone prosecuted more government leakers than all previous administrations combined. So that's not exactly something that the Obama administration can be proud of. But the pushback now is different in that it's much more in front of the curtain rather than behind the curtain. Pressure directly to journalists and/or through the judicial system. Okay. Right now, it's certainly resonating with the public as well.
Okay, Maiko, any lessons learned from your work around the world? If you're a government employee and want to push back against the government, any lessons learned that you might share with people here in the U.S.?
If I was a government employee.
If what has been effective in terms of people using some of these new social tools, internet tools, and Mark, maybe you want to weigh into, to offer some resistance to what you think is a government that is sort of headed in the wrong direction? Like, are there people that have tried things in countries that you've worked in, there's been a crackdown and nothing has changed, or are there people have been successful in sort of creating positive change?
I would say, grassroots mobilization is probably the best way. rather that's through social media campaigns or beyond digital activism. But from what I've learned is that the local the voice of the people really resonates, and governments don't want protest, right? They don't want to be seen as causing chaos and so forth. So in order to eliminate that, I think if they see enough pressure from the citizens, they would want to avoid that and listen.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that I would say about this is that governments are becoming much more sophisticated and subtle in the way they do this now. And they've moved their action away from, really very strong shutdowns. I mean, shutdowns are, a blunt tool, and it does create a lot of pushback. But what's going on now is an attempt by the countries that want to shut down free speech is an attempt to infiltrate the global discussions about internet governance and to try to do away with the multi-stakeholder model that has evolved on that so that civil society and the private sector and all players have a voice, but to try to come up with what they would call a multilateral approach, which is only governments having a voice. And they would like that kind of model to evolve. And they have a vision of an internet that is national, so that they would have switches that would be, where you could throttle the internet and slow it down so that people couldn't share videos. They might still be able to do, basic transactions. Banking would continue and those kinds of things. But when people are trying to organize and trying to build movements, it's sometimes just as effective to throttle the internet and make it slower so that it becomes more difficult for those kinds of high uses of the internet to take place. I mean, those are the kinds of actions that Turkey has taken on several occasions. And I think this infiltration of the global space is one that we need to be very aware about, because that's an area where all of us, the international community, our governments, civil society, and the companies that really matter can get involved. And we're trying at CIMA to build a much greater participation of journalists and media representatives, people from the media industries, to participate in those things, because what is also happening at the same time are actions that really hurt the news media per se, the ability to transmit independent journalism. And that slowdown and that kind of action on the internet is really hurting the ability of independent journalism to survive in this really difficult environment.
So when I'm reading online about internet governance issues, ICANN, that sort of thing, that's not necessarily just grassroots interest that's been planted by foreign governments?
No, I think that when you're reading about internet governance today, we need to be very aware that this is something that is highly complex, and there are many different interests and many different players that need to be represented in that. And CIMA, we work mainly with journalists and media development specialists around the world, and in developing countries in particular. And those people have not been well represented in those talks up until now. So it's really easy for the players on the internet, including the social media companies, Facebook and others, to overnight change their rules to make it, all of a sudden the algorithm says we are favoring video rather than text. So the guy who's trying to do a small internet news service in Senegal sees his access to his readers cut in half overnight, and it has real consequences for his ability to continue providing news and information to the public that he thought he was serving well, but some guy in Silicon Valley changed the algorithm, and now he's off the front page.
Okay. Maiko, you talked about the amplification of grassroots voices we've seen in recent years. One of the reasons that governments sometimes give for shutting down the internet, for throttling social media access, is public safety. There's an election coming up. People are spreading misinformation. People are getting people riled up unfairly. And so for the good of our people, we need to sort of rein things in and back. a bit. Can you talk a little bit about, we've certainly talked about the spread of misinformation, Angel, I'm going to ask you about in the U.S. context next, but the spread of misinformation during the recent election in the U.S. became a big issue either on the facts or on the, people just talking about it being sort of a threat to whatever their particular candidate might have been. How has that played out in the ground in the countries that you've worked? The sort of spread of the simple way of talking about it is fake news. Has that been an issue in the places that you've worked?
I think false information has played a big role in many of the countries where we work. But I would say in order to prevent any type of debates, governments would either pass sweeping, cybercrime laws, for instance, to say that encryption or VPNs are illegal. And they say that's to protect the citizens from any type of violence, but I think that's used at ad hoc basis and not always actually implemented, but it's rather used as a political tool to suppress voter education or some kind of information among voters.
Okay. So misinformation is not a legitimate concern?
Not from what I've seen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Angela, you're on the spot. Is misinformation a legitimate concern in the United States? Was it an issue during this recent election?
Yes and yes.
Okay.
And to elaborate, the term fake news obviously wasn't a term a year ago in the United States. It's something that has come about in the later stages of the long U.S. election cycle. What's been interesting, in addition to the existence and spread of fake news, has been kind of the exposure of a lack of media news literacy among many people. Not just the youth of the U.S., but there are a lot of people that really believed stories that were not actually true. And there's been, I think, a diminishing of respect for facts in news stories. There's certainly a lot of skepticism of the news media. If you look at our approval ratings, they're somewhere down there with members of Congress, which are not great. But as trust in media has diminished, there's been more susceptibility to people believing things that are simply not true. And it certainly happens on both sides of the political spectrum, but statistically, I wish I could remember the source of the study, but a study that came out recently found that voters on the political right were much more likely to believe things that were untrue than voters on the left. And part of that is because, again, statistically speaking, voters on the right tend to get more of their news from fewer sources, whereas voters who tend more to the left generally have a more varied media diet, although you definitely see polarization of news sources on both sides of the political aisle. So if I may step on my soapbox for a second, I will encourage all of you to vary your media diets. Don't watch just one channel, don't read just one website. There's a lot of great journalism being produced out there, and vary your sources so you can get a lot of different perspectives.
Facebook and Google have recently taken steps to flag quote-unquote fake news stories. Is that a good thing?
Yes, it's a good thing, but it's a very challenging thing. Nobody, certainly not Facebook or Google, wants one person or one entity to be the arbiter of what is fake news. Clearly, we've seen the president take the phrase fake news and turn it on its head to label anything that he doesn't like. And that's not what fake news is. Fake news is, by definition, something that is untrue, not something that you just don't like. Everybody can disagree and dislike certain news coverage, but there are websites out there whose sole purpose is to create things that are not true and present them as something that is true and that makes you think that it is true. And probably every one of us has at some point clicked on a fake news story and thought it was true. And hopefully most of us are, have the resources to figure out, well, that doesn't sound right, and I haven't seen that reported anywhere else. That doesn't pass the smell test. But not everybody has that. So in that sense, having a Facebook or a Google have a team of people who are willing to take a look at things that are flagged as fake news and make a decision, that's a good thing. It's certainly good, in my opinion, to see these companies taking some responsibility, because so much of our news is aggregated, especially among Facebook and Google and probably Twitter. But it's very, very hard for somebody to make a firm yes or no judgment call and label something fake or not, especially when there's a lot of gray area.
Okay.
I mean, one of the things that is really interesting about this is that Facebook and Google both say that they have technological means to identify some things that are clearly being manufactured on a very large scale. So they can go back to the original source of these documents that are being spread by machines and through algorithms and other technological means, and identify that these things are suspicious. And I think that kind of identification of suspicious content is a really important part of them maintaining trust with the public and building a safe space for people to share information. So I think, Facebook just recently got a group of professors to put this report out, Information Operations and Facebook, which is, taking this issue really seriously for I would say now finally, after it has gone very far in many parts of the world toward being a place where people could say things that were clearly untrue and clearly provocative, or not provocative, but even inciting kinds of political behaviors that would probably be unconstitutional in the United States. I mean, there is a line somewhere, and I think it's helpful that Facebook and Google and other big players in this space at least are aware that this is happening and do what they can to help prevent it. But I agree with both the previous opinions that they are not in the position to decide on truth and falsehood. I think we do have to live with a certain amount of political language being even intending to deceive opponents or deceive voters, because that is the behavior of political parties. So we're going to have to learn through getting better at discerning and deciding when something is suspicious or not, and decide for ourselves, okay, well, maybe I should look at a separate voice on this and get another opinion, because we can't always believe every single thing we read.
Okay, I'm actually going to use my moderator's prerogative and just satisfy my curiosity, do an instant poll of the audience. People that agree with the idea that companies like Facebook and Google flagging misinformation, fake news stories is a positive. So can we raise hands if we think it's a good thing, and then we'll do bad thing. So good thing, bad thing? That's remarkable. No one raised their hand.
No, we got
This one.
Where's that? I'm sorry. We did?
Yeah.
Bad thing one more time. I'm sorry. There we go. Excellent. Thank you very much. One last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Mark, you talked about that people. What was the statistic again? There are more mobile subscriptions than there are
people
human
on
beings
the globe.
on the planet. So more people have more access to information than has ever been the case in the history of humanity. At the same time, we work in the news business. It can be tough to find a business model to sustain news gathering, news dissemination. Why is it so hard to make that work? If the people seem to have a real appetite for information, why can't we make the economics of news gathering work?
Well, it all has to do with the transition between the traditional media, which had three sort of main platforms: TV, radio, and print. And when we started making this transition into the internet, all of the news producers felt that they could not allow this new medium to come on board without being present. So they put themselves up there for free. And this has turned out to be a business decision that was extremely detrimental to the whole idea of news gathering, because news gathering costs money. And I think the news media provides a really, really critical service that is just as or more valuable today, when we have all this crazy information all over the place. We need arbiters of that information to help us understand what's important and what's valuable to us today, and to go through the day's news, to have a group of people to sit in the newsroom every day and say, what do people in Washington, D.C. need to know today? What are the really important things, and how do we communicate that to them so that they can maintain a well-informed and engaged position in the citizenry. And that role is really important, but it costs money, and we need to figure out a way to share the revenue that is being produced through online advertising. Right now, 85% of that revenue is controlled by the big platforms. And to share that revenue a little bit more equitably with the news producers, because those news producers are producing a vast quantity of content for online media, and there could be an economic kind of way of doing this more effectively. And I think over time we're trying to have that dialogue with Facebook, Google, Apple, Microsoft, all the different big players in this market, and to say to them, you have an interest. This is in your long-term business interest, and this is most important in the developing countries where their growth is much faster now than it is here. And those countries, for the news producers to get their businesses off the ground, they need to have some of the revenue that comes through the clicks that happen on the news stories that they produce. So it's really in the long-term interest of these companies to start to share this revenue and to help build a viable business model that produces high-quality journalism and good-quality media.
Okay, excellent. Angela, do you have a take on making this work in the internet age?
Boy, if I had the solution, I would be owning a news outlet rather than working for one. But
Yeah.
one bright spot is that we've seen subscriptions at many news outlets increase in recent months. The New York Times and Washington Post both have talked about their subscription numbers, and I know, speaking for Politico, we've seen our Politico Pro numbers are strong. There's definitely a demand for information, and at least here in the US, for right now, there's a willingness to pay some sort of money for it. So certainly ad-based revenue is important, and hopefully will continue to be for a long time, just because people aren't willing or able to pay the subscription prices that would be necessary to support a news gathering operation without the benefit of advertising revenue also. But I do see some hope that for right now, and hopefully we can find a way to keep riding this wave, consumers are willing to pay for subscriptions.
Okay, good to hear. Maiko, do you have anything?
A little bit off topic, but I think another important point to remember is in a lot of the places where Mark and I work, the media is owned by the state, so there's no place for citizens to voice their opinions. And today I was reading about how in Malaysia, some journalists who are talking about some sensitive issues about political leaders on WhatsApp are getting arrested because of their conversations on social media, and that's troubling if they don't have a space to talk about it on the media because that's state controlled, and now
there's nowhere to go. Okay, excellent. So let's open up for questions. Do we have a microphone? Or we do have a microphone, and if you could identify yourself, and if you have a relevant affiliation, give that would be great. So yeah, right here.
I want to say thank you for guys sharing this free information with the public. I'm Jordan Sellers. I'm a student at Howard University. We are going through public policy crisis in this country in terms of where we want to take criminal justice. I am a graduate student at Howard. I'm taking a gap year. My focus is public administration. I ended up having to stop going to school because my grades dropped and I couldn't afford the tuition. So I started looking at some of the social things that we were going through under the previous administration with same-sex marriage and marriage equality. And nationwide, there was an anti-black male campaign that I've started through my think tank that really did pick up where we left off with that public policy crisis. My question, I guess for each one of you, him and her, really is about whether or not this country can get past or overcome same-sex marriage and marriage equality, what we did in this nation, and where we're going in the 21st century with criminal justice that might still be spewing, given the fact that this anti-black male is not enough to deal with the LGBT community in specific neighborhoods that maybe say this is about race, religion, sex, or gender, and it's not really giving us the public policy that we need on Capitol Hill.
So if we're talking about internet access and the free flow of online information, is there a component that fits into your question?
Well, yeah, we'll give an example of like what we did through the Capitol Pride Alliance. And at the very end of this administration, it was about, 50 people who took their lives, given the fact that it may have been racial profiling that was the number one thing. A black male who considered himself a part of a homosexual community in another community or neighborhood that was more heterosexual might have interfered with, some type of hate crime there. So the question is whether you're doing community policing through Neighborhood Watch and you're reporting your own crime in your neighborhood. It's not the fear of the truth setting you free. It's just basically, I think the news did a good job with Black Lives Matter, how far they went with that. Some of it was about LGBTQ. It wasn't like they were trying to do a major cover-up. My question is, whatever type of social networking or social platform you're using, Twitter, you name it, does it help with community policing and where certain neighborhoods are going with what they were fighting for as far as criminal justice? Homosexuals in certain neighborhoods, heterosexuals in other neighborhoods, and really where we're going in this nation with same-sex marriage as far as a policy, marriage equality as a policy, and then thinking that crisis, given what we're doing in our own neighborhoods, is not really being reported, or is something suspicious going on there, and maybe it is about more hate crimes taking place.
Okay, does anyone have any thoughts on community policing, community monitoring that they want to throw in?
I mean, I would say that, one of the things that the internet and social media has opened up is the whole concept of governance and how it works. It's really, governance has now been digitized. And, we used to have, institutions that, we had the police and we had the courts and we had all these different institutions that played a role. Well, today, those institutions are still there, but a lot of what's happening is happening as a result of debates and sometimes bullying and other things that are happening in the digital space. So I agree with you that that realm of interaction, and this is true at a global level, is becoming more and more pronounced and more important in helping countries decide what they want to do and what their public policies are and what their what they want to what kinds of things they want to focus on. And we have not yet reached the point where this is well governed. We have not figured out how to mediate these debates and to ensure that that the winner is just the loudest voice, not a or the most effective institution that gets access to everybody. So I think we've got a long way to go to figure out how to do that, and it's something I have to say that I have I'm more positive about it than negative, because it is a more open society that this helps us build. But we have to figure out how to do it. We have to get better at it, and we have to find a way in developing countries where people do need to have a voice in public policy making, as well as in our own societies where we don't want just a few to dominate the conversation.
I guess the thing that comes to mind to me is the Nextdoor platform, which a lot of people are probably familiar with. It's micro listservs run by one overall website, Nextdoor. But there have certainly been some questions brought about with that platform about profiling of various sorts. But it's mostly an unmoderated community, so it's definitely an open question about. Is it the company's role to make sure that people aren't profiling their neighbors? Is it up to individuals? So it's very much an open question. It's a new platform. I think probably most people would say we don't want Big Brother coming in and telling people what they can and can't do in terms of free speech. But the conversations can get very heated, and people may not think when they're describing something about how it may affect somebody else, one of their neighbors. So that's something that we haven't seen government involvement in that, but it's something to keep an eye on, because it's something that we have seen get increase in attention as neighbors evolve with how they communicate about what's going on. Everyone works different hours, and more communication is online compared with talking in the driveway or wherever, like it was a generation ago. So I think that will be something to watch to see if there is any sort of policy play as we go forward with platforms like that.
Excellent. Okay, let's go right over here.
Hi, Glenn Marcus, Press Freedom Committee, National Press Club, and it's great to see Andrea, who is one of the former presidents of the club. One of the many elephants in the room is the net neutrality argument. Any thoughts about how that affects the topic of the day?
I guess that's me.
Well, it's a question around the world. And I hate to say it, if we could keep it short, I'd love to get a couple more questions in before we.
At least right now, the net neutrality debate is hot in the U.S. If you haven't watched it yet, go watch John Oliver's segment on net neutrality from last night. It's available now on YouTube if you don't have HBO. But it's about 20 minutes long. But he really hits the marks in terms of what's going on and takes a very wonky issue and breaks it down. So yeah, I think the net neutrality debate is very relevant to what we're talking about. It's not government censorship, but it's putting the power in the hands of a few. And the argument of people who are supportive of changing the U.S. net neutrality rules, which went into place during the Obama administration, say that companies can regulate themselves. They don't need the government to be heavy-handed and tell them what they can or can't do, and that they'll treat internet traffic equally, even absent regulation. There's another side that's very, very vocal right now. In fact, crashed the FCC website this morning with all the comments that they're already putting in after John Oliver's show. But that side posits that we do need regulation of the internet in terms of making sure that internet providers allow all internet traffic to proceed equally. And they argue that even if there isn't discrimination among Netflix versus HBO streaming or whatever right now, that potential very much exists, and that there should be a watchdog in the form of the government taking care to ensure that that anyone who wants to communicate via the internet is able to do so equally. So yeah, I think net neutrality is very much a part of this debate, and it's something that will play out probably over the rest of this year, at least at the FCC here.
And I would just say that U.S. regulation on these kinds of things is really important, even though this is not something that is actually a national only issue. So what is decided here affects the rest of the world. The internet doesn't really currently have national borders. Mm-hmm. It has different kinds of borders. And so this is a really big and significant issue for journalists in developing countries and emerging democracies. So if those rules allow companies to slow down the internet based on how popular it is or how profitable it is for a big company, the first people to really be hurt by this are going to be people in developing countries. Mm-hmm. So it is a very big issue for our community. And I think it's really unfortunate that there hasn't been a wider discussion about it, and I'm glad that John Oliver brought it up.
How does what happens in the U.S. spread to other countries, just sort of by...
Well, because we set the standards. Up until recently, there was not even a real open, multi-stakeholder discussion about internet governance. And now there is one that has been put into place. So that was done under the Obama administration, where the rules of the game were changed, and we did away with the U.S.-dominated, company-dominated system that had really put the internet into place. The internet was a cooperative venture among defense and academic and other contractors that worked together to create the rules about how information is exchanged and about how these things would work. And in general, I think it was done in a way that was focusing on the importance of exchanging information across the world. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, it was a really global and very positive thing. But as we move into a world where more and more of these relationships are dominated by large companies who are making gobs and gobs of money on it, then the stakes grow for individuals and companies and players and countries to try to dominate this system. And we need a system that allows these other voices to be heard.
Right here in the blue.
Hi, Shannon McGuire. I'm with USAID. I focus on press freedom in the Europe-Eurasia region. And my question is about fake news. Obviously, in the former Soviet Union, fake news is not new at all. It used to be very heavy-handed propaganda. Now it's very sophisticated manipulation, misinformation, disinformation, whatever you want to call it. Do you have examples of effective media literacy efforts? So other than Facebook flagging fake news, do you have examples of things like, I'm thinking of fact-checking or debunking websites, which some research has shown sometimes at best it's preaching to the choir, and at worst sometimes it's reinforcing myths or deepening distrust of media or further polarizing. So do you have some interesting examples in other parts of the world of effective media literacy efforts, especially for policy and development folks like me?
Has anything worked in Russia?
We're working on it.
I have one I'll point to real quickly here in the U.S. It's called the News Literacy Project, and it's run by a former LA Times reporter whose name escapes me at the moment, but it's a great program. It's aimed at youth, so its target audience is, I think, middle school kids, trying to get young people before they're set in their ways about how they consume media and make them understand and be critical thinkers about the news. So that's here in the U.S. Hopefully you two can point to other things overseas.
I would say that CIPE, in conjunction with Mark's organization SEMA and National Democratic Institute, we're leading this initiative to dive into digital literacy among civil societies that are not digital activists. And there's a huge gap of where organizations that work in, say, democracy reform and so forth are not they're not aware of what they read on Facebook is accurate or not, and they're not really well informed. So I think there's a huge gap that I would push back to USAID and other funders, that there is this potential space where you can really work to support organizations at the local level to educate the importance of what's out there is not accurate, like how to decipher that and train on those issues.
One last thing on that is that we've been talking to different groups around the world about this issue, and activists and civil society organizations and media activists regularly report that media literacy is the #1 challenge for their societies today. That this is really changing the extent to which people can use news media and internet and social media. But the efforts so far on that have been much too isolated and small scale to really have an impact, and that what everybody tells us is that it needs to be really widespread through the education system, and it needs to be at a very young age that people start to have media literacy training, that you need to work with children. That's the #1 issue that we get when we ask people about that topic.
Excellent. I think we have time for one last question. Yeah.
Will Ferragaro, a consultant to PSEC Lab on online hate speech and other organizations. My question, Mark kind of touched on some of the kind of global picture, but I wondered if you could, I haven't been to an IGF, Internet Governance Forum, for a couple of years now, so I wondered if you could speak a little bit about as far as I understood, the IGF needed to be set in place to meet regularly. There was the battle, the multi-stakeholder battle versus the ICTU, and if you could speak a little bit about the status of where those battles are. And then maybe the rest of you, if you could comment on one initiative, and Europe differs from the US, but Germany has put forward an initiative, I think in the Bundestag, to look at penalizing by statute hate speech and offensive speech. And I wondered if you could speak to that, about legislative initiatives, particularly in other contexts. Thank you.
Well, we have, on the internet governance issue and the way the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, and the other institutions that work on this topic. My colleague Dan O'Malley here and a group of people worked on a report on that topic that I recommend to you. And we had some at the back of the room, but I think they all went away. Do I have it? Yeah, it's called Media Development in the Development Age: 5 Ways to Engage in Internet Governance. And it gives a really good overview of where these debates stand right now, and 5 big institutions that are playing various roles in this, because there's so many different things, so many different aspects about this. And I have to say that I tend to be much more optimistic about the way things are going right now, because it is a more open, participatory, multi-stakeholder environment than it used to be, although that has created a confusing debate because there's so many different interests. But I think, it has created some awareness about what's going on in the rest of the world, about the fact that some decision made in Silicon Valley can affect some news producer in Senegal. Those kinds of issues are coming into the debate, and we are trying to get more media development activists to participate, and it's now possible for them to do so. So if you really care about this stuff, this is an open forum now. You can go to the meetings and you can actually have an impact on what happens there. So I think that's a good thing. We still have a struggle with the authoritarian states in particular, who, as I said earlier, are trying to get the initiative in their hands, and they would like to have a nationalized internet where they could have switches and controls that, Russia has now made it a requirement that everybody have, servers inside the country where they store their data. These kinds of, initiatives are an attempt to draw boundaries and to create the ability of governments to close things down or shut them or slow them down. And that's right now that debate is very much ongoing. It will be an ongoing debate for years to come. But in general, I tend toward the more optimistic side and think we have a chance to push this in a positive direction.
On this question of criminalizing hate speech is sort of the...
This is nothing that CIPE does, but my colleagues at NDI, their gender team is looking into online violence against women, especially during elections. And their first initiative is to look at the number of times this happens in X country or during X elections. And I think that their purpose is to start spreading awareness that this is already happening, but legislatures may not be aware of.
Anything on that?
Nope.
Nope. Excellent. With that, thank you all so much. Thank you, Mark, Angela, Maiko, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and you all for coming. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.